Hello, English 9 students. Let's take a look at the story A Man Called Horse by Dorothy M. Johnson. Section 1, Exposition. He was a young man of good family, as the phrase went in the New England of 100-odd years ago, and the reasons for his bitter discontent were unclear, even to himself. He grew up in the gracious old Boston home under his grandmother's care, for his mother had died in giving him birth, and all his life he had known every comfort and privilege his father's wealth could provide. But still there was the discontent which puzzled him because he could not even define it. He wanted to live among his equals, people who were no better than he and no worse either. That was as close as he could come to describing the source of his unhappiness in Boston and his restless desire to go somewhere else. In the year 1845, he left home and went west, far beyond the country's creeping frontier, where he hoped to find his equals. He had the idea that in Indian country, where there was danger, all white men were kings, and he wanted to be one of them. But he found, in the West as in Boston, that the men he respected were still his superiors, even if they could not read, and those he did not respect weren't worth talking to. He did have money, however, and he could hire the men he respected. He hired 4 of them to cook and hunt and guide and be his companions, but he found them not friendly. They were apart from him, and he was still alone. He still brooded about his status in the world, longing for his equals. Paragraph 6. On a day in June, he learned what it was to have no status at all. He had become a captive of a small raiding party of Crow Indians. He heard gunfire and the brief shouts of his companions around the bend of the creek just before they died, but he never saw their bodies. He had no chance to fight because he was naked and unarmed, bathing in the creek when a Crow warrior seized and held him. His captor let him go at last, let him run. Then the lot of them rode him down for sport, striking him with their coup sticks. They carried the dripping scalps of his companions, and one had skinned off Baptiste's black beard as well, for a trophy. They took him along in a matter-of-fact way, as they took the captured horses. He was unshod and naked as the horses were, and like them, he had a rawhide thong around his neck. So long as he didn't fall down, the Crows ignored him. On the second day, they gave him his breeches. His feet were too swollen for his boots, but one of the Indians threw him a pair of moccasins that had belonged to the half-breed Henry, who was dead back at the creek. The captive wore the moccasins gratefully. The third day, they let him ride one of the spare horses so the party could move faster, and on that day, they came in sight of their camp. He thought of trying to escape, hoping he might be killed in flight rather than by slow torture at the camp, but he never had a chance to try. They were more familiar with escape than he was, and knowing what to expect, they forestalled it. The only other time he had tried to escape from anyone, he had succeeded. When he had left his home in Boston, his father had raged and his grandmother had cried, but they could not talk him out of his intention. Paragraph 12. The men of the Crow raiding party didn't bother with talk. Before riding into camp, they stopped and dressed in their regalia and in parts of their victims' clothing. They painted their faces black. Then, leading the white man by the rawhide around his neck, as though he were a horse, they rode down toward the teepee circle, shouting and singing, brandishing their weapons. He was unconscious when they got there. He fell and was dragged. He lay dazed and battered near a teepee, while the noisy, busy life of the camp swarmed around him and Indians came to stare. Thirst consumed him, and when it rained, he lapped rainwater from the ground like a dog. A scrawny, shrieking, eternally busy old woman with ragged graying hair threw a chunk of meat on the grass, and he fought the dogs for it. When his head cleared, he was angry. Although anger was an emotion he knew he could not afford. It was better when I was a horse, he thought, when they led me by the rawhide around my neck. I won't be a dog no matter what. The hag gave him stinking, rancid grease and let him figure out what it was for. He applied it gingerly to his bruised and sun-seared body. Now, he thought, I smell like the rest of them. While he was healing, he considered coldly the advantages of being a horse. A man would be humiliated, and sooner or later he would strike back, and that would be the end of him. But a horse had only to be docile. Very well, he would learn to do without pride. He understood that he was the property of the screaming old woman, a fine gift from her son, one that she liked to show off. She did more yelling at him than at anyone else, probably to impress the neighbors so they would not forget what a great and generous man her son was. She was bossy and proud, a dreadful sag of skin and bones, and she was a devilish hard worker. The white man, who now thought of himself as a horse, forgot sometimes to worry about his danger. He kept making mental notes of things to tell his own people in Boston about this hideous adventure. He would go back a hero and he would say, "Grandmother, let me fetch your shawl. I've been accustomed to doing little errands for another lady about your age." Two girls lived in the teepee with the old hag and her warrior son. One of them, the white man concluded, was his captor's wife, and the other was his little sister. The daughter in law was smug and spoiled. Being beloved, she did not have to be useful. The younger sister had bright, wandering eyes. Often enough, they wandered to the white man, who was pretending to be a horse. The two girls worked when the old woman put them at it, but they were always running off to do something they enjoyed more. There were games and noisy contests, and there was much laughter, but not for the white man. He was finding out what loneliness could be.